Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to let you know about a new project that we've been on the Seaside Eastern Shore. But first, we got to walk through some basics of our work. So while I made the title Seagrasses, we're going to actually be talking about underwater grasses, prairies of the sea. So what are underwater grasses? These are plants that grow underwater. A lot of times we call them submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV. The thing I want you to consider is that these are true flowering plants. They're angiosperms, just like the plants on the surface of the earth. Really neat set of plants. I want to let you know they're not algae. They are true flowering plants, just like the plants you have on the surface of the earth, daffodils, grasses, and all that. These are seagrasses, but they grow underwater. True vascular plants. They flower. They have no stomata. They have a very thin cuticle. They do all kinds of neat things, just like land plants, but they do it underwater. So let's kind of walk back a few 100 million years ago and figure out where they came from. So 200 million years ago, this is when the terrestrial living plants on the earth came about. When we had two major points of continents, Laurasia and Gondwanaland. So fast forward about 100 million years, and this is when our seagrasses started to appear in the middle Cretaceous, when the continents reached about where they are today. They evolved in a very, very different environment. So over 100 million years, we had some very interesting changes in CO2 concentrations, which is in that middle graph. And sea level, as probably you all know, has changed dramatically over this time frame. And it's also the time in which all of the different species evolved. So over the 100 million years, we now have our group of seagrasses. But also during that time, when you look at the terrestrial species, there are about 250,000 species of living plants, trees, shrubs, herbs, and all that. The freshwater plants are only 400 to 500, but only 72 species of true seagrasses, seagrasses that require salt and grow completely underwater. These grasses, they occur on all the continents of the world except for the Antarctic. It's just a little bit too cold down there for anything to live except for penguins and people that study them. Thinking of our backyard here in the Chesapeake Bay, we have a variety of grasses that go from the top of the bay and the Susquehanna Flats all the way to the head of the bay. So we have some freshwater plants, they're called wild celery and hydrilla. In the middle part of the bay, we have some redhead grass and what I call sago pondweed. As you move to the head of the bay, we have what's called eelgrass, this true seagrass. Now they require very interesting salinities and light. So wild celery would not live in the lower bay where we have high salinities. Eelgrass in the lower bay wouldn't live in the upper bay because it wants salt. The interesting thing about these plants is that they require a lot of light. And that little, the red numbers up there are how much light the plants require. Now, I want to highlight this. These seagrasses, they require more light than any other living plant on the surface of the earth. If you look at, for example, on the right column, there's some of the plants that live in the water. These are phytoplankton and green algae. They don't require a lot of light. The seagrasses require 10 to 30% of light that reaches the plant. That's a lot. On the surface of the earth, trees and plants and shrubs may require 1%. And these plants are very responsive to changes in light, which is why in the Chesapeake Bay, some of the issues that we have with regard to light, the seagrasses and freshwater plants die because there's just not a lot of light. So because they're very sensitive to water quality and light, we call them the canary in the mine shaft for global coastal impacts. They're sentinel species. They respond very, very rapidly to change in the environment, just like the miners that would bring a canary into the coal mine to let them know how well the air is. Okay, so one of the things that we talk about seagrasses, they're ecosystem engineers. That is, they change the environment where they grow through a variety of things. So they provide a lot of oxygen for the bottom. They stabilize the sediments. They love nutrients, but not too many. And it creates structure. And also the new topic, blue carbon. These plants are now being considered in fight against climate change by absorbing carbon into the sediment. So that's kind of a cool thing. We're all certainly worried about climate change and because of the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. So these seagrasses, along with plants like mangroves and marshes, are being considered in the fight to improve the climate around the Earth by taking in carbon. Now, what I like about the plants most is that these are structured habitats, and you see all kinds of neat creatures in the grass bed or feeding on the grass bed. So turtles and dugongs and manatees love seagrass, and that's where you're going to find some of these creatures. They're really reliant. But here in Chesapeake Bay, you've got all kinds of small creatures like scuds and pipefish and fish, and more importantly, blue crab. Blue crab really needs seagrass because if you guys, any of you like soft crabs, which I just bought a couple this morning to eat this afternoon, that's where you're going to find some soft crabs. You know, you'll get people that will go try to get crabs and get them from seagrasses. So very important habitat for these crabs to live and survive while they molt. Now, seagrasses, unfortunately, because they live in coastal areas, are being threatened by a variety of human impacts. We call it eutrophication, which is sometimes a word for too many nutrients. We have too many sediments because if you're not careful about your land and how it is developed, you can have a lot of sediment coming into the water, which clouds the water and makes it not appropriate for plants to live. And with climate change, we get sea level rise and we get more and more erosion that will wipe out seagrasses. We also have extreme weather. We have boating and dredging. And we also have some invasive creatures that are unfortunate, outcompete or kill grass. The extreme weather is something that we are worried about because if you've been watching news and just being outside, we know that our climate is changing radically over a short period of time, primarily due to the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the environment. The other is that seagrasses are a very valuable habitat. We try at times to put a dollar value on how much a hectare or several acres of seagrass are worth. And the numbers support the fact that seagrasses are more important than salt marshes, mangroves, corals, and tropical coral reefs. But we're also losing seagrasses as we are some of the other habitats. And that is a concern for a lot of us that have seen how valuable these habitats are for human beings. And for seagrasses, we did some work where we started looking at where seagrasses were in the early 50s, 60s, and 70s, and what's happened since 1980. And we've lost 9% of our seagrasses, and we're losing almost a couple of football fields of seagrass every few minutes. It's a lot of seagrass being lost around the world, not just here in the Bay, but around the world. Now, in the Chesapeake Bay, we've been monitoring seagrasses using aerial photography, and at VIMS, we map every seagrass plant from the mouth of the bay to the head of the bay. And what you see in the left is a view of the Chesapeake Bay, and all that red that you see along the shoreline, those are all mapped seagrass beds. And if you look at the graph on the right, you see these curves and colors, and over time, from when we started monitoring the seagrasses in the 70s through today, you see that we are actually seeing more and more grasses in the bay. That's great. Now, we also have set a restoration goal for the Chesapeake Bay, and that goal is 185,000 acres. And as of 2018, we had 54% of the restoration goal, and that is about where we are in 2019 and 2020. And so, like I said, we are very careful about where we map, we want to map, and there's been a lot of effort to try to improve the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, and that's a great thing, but the battle is never over because we have more development going on, and we're going to have to watch what happens to our seagrasses because, as I indicated before, they're the sentinel of water quality. When they change, we know that the water quality of the bay is not doing really well. Okay, so let's kind of look at one particular species because this is a species that we're doing a lot of work during the bay that will be part of the talk later on about what we're doing on Seaside Bay. So if you look at the graph on the left, you see the Chesapeake Bay with lots of gray. Well, that's where eelgrass, which is the true seagrass that we work with, that's where it occurred pre-1933. Well, in the 30s, we had a disease and climate change to the degree that most of the grass died back, but it came back. And you'll notice that in a couple of places, you don't see that red. You don't see it if you look at the area to the middle graph, you'll see that there's an area to the right by the Atlantic Ocean where there's no grass anymore. And then if you look at the 1990s to that period, even though we lost some seagrass in the Chesapeake Bay, the area that was the lower eastern shore Delmarva Peninsula is still absent. And so what happened over this time, we had diseases, we had hurricanes, and ended up with not a lot of seagrasses in some places in the bay and in the coastal bays. What was interesting about the loss of the seagrasses in these coastal bays, so going back about 100 years, in the 1920s and early 30s, in the seaside bays where there was abundant seagrass, there was a bay scallop that was very abundant that supported the commercial fishery. And if you look at the years in the harvest and how much it meant to the economy and what it was in today's dollars, you'll see that in 1925 through 1932, there were bay scallops harvested by commercial watermen. But when the eelgrass died out, which was in 1932 and 1933, all the scallops disappeared and they were never seen again. That's because bay scallops require the eelgrass as a habitat to live in. And so when the eelgrass declined, so did the bay scallop, and never have we seen it since. So, given that, let's move into the area that I think is of most interest to a lot of people and for the talk today, seagrasses, or the gardening secrets for how we want to restore these beds. There's a lot of interest now, as I indicated, in restoring seagrasses because of their value. 50 years ago when I got involved, people could care less about seagrasses. They thought it was just a place you wouldn't want to walk through because it was icky and you got your crop messed up with grass and it was a place you wouldn't go swimming. Well, today we realize just how important they are. And people who used to have seagrass in front of their houses that didn't want it, now it's gone. And they keep on asking us, well, how can I get seagrasses back in front of my house? And of course, we try our best to do what we can in those areas where we try to destroy seagrasses. But it's not easy because just like anything else, once you lose something like seagrasses, trying to get it back is not very easy. We at VIMS have been very interested in trying to get seagrasses back. So we've tried a variety of techniques in restoring seagrass, from using adult plants. So you see, we use a machine. We sometimes hand planted individual shoots. You see the diver on the left-hand side, putting individual shoots. Sometimes we would collect large amounts of sediment with the grass, like a sod, and we would plant that, as you see these divers, in patterns that we can follow. That's a lot of hard work, trying to collect adult plants, dig them up, plant them. We started some work where we were very interested in whether we could use seeds. Now remember, these are true plants, just like every plant on the surface of the earth. They produce seeds. They flower underwater, They don't have these really pretty flowers that you might see today in your gardens or on the side of the road, but they still have male and female parts, and they get pollinated underwater, and they produce seeds. So we've been using a variety of methods to collect seeds and to put them out. So one time we used a harvester that was used for getting invasive plants, and we used different types of netting to put seeds out. But it's still very difficult to get seeds and to put them out in the field so we get grass that's back. But we've tried, and we do have now a unique method to collect seeds and get a lot of seeds out. So our seed collection sometimes is very simple. We go around with a net and try to pick up seeds that are there floating on the surface. We also collect large amounts of what we call flowering shoots. So you see on the left-hand figure, a tank of ours, seawater tank with lots of grass in it. Well, that grass are the flowering shoots, which has seeds. Now, a lot of times we'll collect them by hand and put them in these mesh bags, as you see the person on the upper right. She's got a bag of flowering shoots that we collected by hand, and all that goes into those big tanks. And the little figure on the right, which is someone's hands, that hand has about, maybe 10,000 seeds of eelgrass. You have to look kind of close because they're small. They're about the size of a grain of rice. So now let's get into this project that we're talking about on the seaside of the Eastern Shore, where prior to 1933, eelgrass was incredibly abundant. So that little box there tells you where we're talking about: seaside of Virginia, coastal bays, oceanside, supported bay scallop, which we talked about abundantly earlier. Well, in 33 through 1997, eelgrass disappeared, and through 1997, no one ever saw eelgrass again. And of course, as I mentioned, never saw bay scallops. Well, in 1997, we discovered some small natural patches, and we said, oh, this is kind of cool. I wonder why, how they got there. They were big enough that they were more than a few years old, and we know how these plants grow, so we could tell that there was a bunch of patches that were several years old. And so in those coastal bays, we started doing some experiments where we put plants out to tell us, okay, is the water quality in the bottom okay for seagrasses to recover? And sure enough, all the work that we started in 1997 through 2001, everything grew, and we said, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. So what we did was, because these areas are pretty large in bays, we decided that we would use these eelgrass seeds to restore the seagrasses. So every year through today, we have been harvesting these flowering shoots by hand, and we bring them back and get the seeds, and then we put them out in the fall. So we now knew that the reason why eelgrass never recovered to these bays, guess what? They never had any seeds that were left after they died, all the plants died down. So it was very simply what we call a seed recruitment issue. And through today, which actually this past week, I was over on the Eastern Shore with the Nature Conservancy volunteers, and some of you may have heard about that, where we use volunteers to harvest flowering shoots about the last couple of weeks in May. And we use those seeds to reseed areas that are in the coastal bays that did not have seagrass, but now have it, or coming back slowly. So it's kind of been a neat project. Now, here's a kind of a series of what we've done. You'll see there's on the left-hand side a flowering shoot, and those little things in the middle, those are the seeds of eelgrass in the little pods. And we collect them, and you can see that little penny there. That's how big they are. What we found, we have tried a variety of ways to get seeds into the bottom, and we tried mechanical ways and all this stuff. What we found is that it is actually very easy just to throw them off the side of the boat. We know from our experiments that seeds that we throw on the bottom don't move far from where they settle, and we don't have to put straw on it to hold the seeds. They don't get washed out. And to prove that they don't move far, you can see in the middle where that arrow goes from the boat to those two slides, those what look like square-like things that are dark compared to the bottom, those are 1 acre plots of eelgrass that we seeded. Now, to prove that, we went out and put seeds and we spelled the letters NOAA. Now, those are, believe it or not, half-acre areas, and Noaa stands for National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. It's one of the organizations that have funded us. But we proved to people that we simply throw seeds off the boat, and we did it just by taking, seeds and spelling letters. We said, oh, this is cool because you can put the seeds out and they stay there regardless of what happens in terms of activities to move them. So pretty cool method, and that's what we've been doing since 2001. And there is the enhanced Noaa. What you see on the left-hand side are 2 bays. If you look carefully, you'll see these are the barrier islands, and the dark areas that you see with little yellow dots on it are the areas of eelgrass that have returned, that they weren't there 20 years ago. And those dots, and you see some squares, those are the places that we initially put eelgrass seeds out. The most interesting thing is that when we put the seeds out, we found that nature decided that she would help us a bit. And because the plants that we put out as seeds, they grew, and they themselves started to flower and produce seeds. And so they started spreading naturally throughout these areas, where today we have almost 9,000 acres of seagrass. So here's a kind of a picture from 2001 to 2018 to 20, and you'll see some green, yellowish green areas. What that represents are beds that are either very sparse or very dense based on the color. And you can see the progression from when we started in 2001 in South Bay, one of the 4 bays that we worked, through 2018 to 20, that those beds have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, denser and denser and denser. And so through 2020, we have put roughly 75 million seeds broadcast into 595 individual acres. And nature has taken those plants and spread to where we now have 9,000 acres of eelgrass, where there were no beds of eelgrass in 1997. Pretty cool, pretty cool. So we're pretty stoked on it, and we're continuing. As I said, I was out this past week with volunteers from the Nature Conservancy, collecting seeds to continue this work. Nature Conservancy is a great group that we collaborate with. They help us get the seeds and help us broadcast them. And they've been doing this every year for the last 20 years. New group to work with, and with the volunteers that go out and help us collect. Now, the next step in this process, we are very, very interested in getting the bay scallop back. This is another ball game. It's going to take a lot more work to get these. And so you see the bay scallop there on the left-hand side. What we do is we have been putting little baby scallops that we grow in our laboratory on the Eastern Shore in Watch Creek. And we put these little baby scallops out everywhere, hoping that they will grow and they will themselves respond and spawn and settle in these grass beds where they used to occur. So when you see that middle graph there, the middle figure, you'll see, again, these are those coastal bays. There are those barrier islands in the middle. You'll see these large number of red dots within the yellow bounded area. What that is are each of those dots, we go out once a year in July, and we put down that little white object you see where there's a hand, and we feel for bay scallops. Every year, and we're going to do this in about 2 weeks, we go to every one of those little red dots, and we put down this white quadrant, and it's about a square yard, and we feel for bay scallops, and we've been doing that, and we've been finding lots of bay scallops. Now, this project is a tough one because the bay scallops only live 2 years. They spawn, they produce swimming larvae, and those larvae require eelgrass to put themselves with a little bristlefoot, just like a mussel, and that's where they attach, and then they grow in the seagrass beds. So we've been finding lots of bay scallops. These are some numbers. They don't represent big numbers, but when we started this work In 2012 or 2011, we had no day scallops. The numbers you see there for the 3 different days that we work, you'll see that the numbers vary quite a bit by year because that's the nature of this one animal, and that it's a pretty cool animal, but it is something that we're hoping in the not too distant future that it will become part of the ecosystem that was there many, many years ago. So we're hoping to keep our fingers crossed. We got the big survey coming up. We do this. We usually put out 8 different boats with 4 or 5 people per boat, and it takes about 3 days to go to all those areas that we saw in the red dots to harvest the bay scallop. And with that, I want to first thank you, but we're going to show a video in a minute. We have required people to fund us, so we have to thank all these agencies that have funded us over time. And without funding, we probably could not have done that. So you'll see funding from University of Virginia, Nature Conservancy, BIMS, and the Army Corps, and we've got money from fishery license funds and all that. So without the funding, this project would have never been possible. And so with that, I'm going to share with you a video. It runs about 10 minutes, and it really highlights what we have done in these coastal bays over the last 20 plus years. So with that, we're going to move on, and we're going to now see the video. So hold tight, it'll be on soon.
This area has always, prided itself on its agricultural and seafood and nature. And people put a lot of adjacent to an undeveloped stretch of the Atlantic coastline. You go to an inlet in Florida, you got 50 boats going through the inlet every morning. You go out here and you're lucky if you see another boat some days. A pandemic destroyed all the eelgrass from the North Sea and Europe over to New England down to North Carolina. Came back everywhere else because there were low salinity refuge areas that provided seeds to reseed the area. We didn't have any seed refuges and there wasn't any seed sourced, so it disappeared and stayed gone basically. The grass stabilized all the sediments in the bottom, and when the grass disappeared, all that sediment along with all the oysters washed in the channels and filled them up until they started planting the grass. I saw a presentation JJ gave of some work he did in the York River where he showed the track of the boat across the bottom. You could see it in an aerial photo where they had thrown the seeds overboard. And I went, this guy's got something here.
Seeking funding and getting funding is always a challenge because a lot of people didn't fully appreciate the fact that what we were trying to do could be accomplished. Laura is the director of the Coastal Zone Management Program funded by the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. She felt that this was worth the gamble, and in the late 90s began her support through our program.
Got a call from Bob asking if we had some money to do a little investigative research on SAV restoration. And so we started this program that we called our Seaside Heritage Program. And it was about the eelgrass and the oysters, but also sustainable industries on the eastern shore that depend on natural resources flourishing.
Seagrasses, or what we refer to in this region as submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, are true flowering plants. They are these fabulous underwater prairies that support numerous animals and plants, and they are very, very important in sequestering large amounts of carbon in the sediments. One of our interests was, can we restore seagrasses, first to understand why they were declining, and can we begin a program to restore them?
So we are out here in the Mobjack Bay. We are collecting flowering shoots of eelgrass that have seeds. So when we first started doing this work, we were basically collecting these flowering shoots by hand. And that was okay if we wanted just a few seeds, but since we wanted to enhance our seed-based restoration work with a lot of seeds, the only way we were going to do that would be to create a machine that would cut the plants and give us the numbers of seeds that we would need. And these are the seeds that we are going to be using for our seed-based restoration work on the seaside of the Eastern Shore.
So what we're doing today is getting the seeds that we need for our seagrass restoration project. So what we've learned from our research is that seeds that are really good fall very fast. So in order to separate a lot of the good seeds from the seeds that are not so good, we drop them in this flume, and all the good seeds fall very quickly to the bottom. And so anything that's not very good is going to go past a certain point on the tank. And so what we'll have is essentially all the good seeds falling here and all the bad seeds falling further down the tank because they're lighter. So all we have for our restoration work will be basically all very good seeds. Because we know that seeds germinate in a period around mid-November, we put the seeds out, literally broadcasting them as we do from the boat in either late September, early October, about a month before they germinate. And then what we'll do is come out in the spring and we'll look at all the seedlings that have developed from those, and then from there, those plants will grow and spread the way they've done for millions of years. Okay, so here we are in the spring. The seeds were put out in October. They germinated in November and have been growing very slowly through the winter and early spring. So in order for us to understand how successful the seed germinations were, we go out like we do now, and in the plot that we put the seeds out earlier this fall, we count the number of seedlings in the plot, and that will give us an idea of how many seedlings were successful for the winter. From those seedlings, they will grow and survive through the summer and produce plants for future growth and future seedlings. We just finished looking at the seedlings in this plot, and it looks like we had successful germination and establishment. Looks like maybe between 5 and 10% of the seeds that we put out this past fall have germinated, and we'll just watch this plot for the future and see how it does. The challenges weren't as great as we had expected. The surprise was how quickly these plants developed and spread to these areas that had not been seeded.
When we started working here in 1997, it was zippo, no grass at all. In the 20 years that we've been doing this, the grass has spread to now, I think in 2018, 8,800 acres.
I don't know that we ever even dared
No.
dream as big as what's actually happened on the seaside of the Eastern Shore. So it's just been one of the most rewarding projects I think I've ever worked on. It's fantastic.
And there's nothing like this in the world. Very few people have ever been able to say that they've seen an eelgrass area come back the way we have seen here in just 20 years, literally overnight. That's what, it really was. It's literally almost overnight.
Yeah.
And it's continuing to grow. As we saw the success that we were having, we began to ask the question, well, if we get seagrass back to some level, could we even think of restoring the bay scallop? The bay scallop was a big commercial fishery in the 20s and early 30s when eelgrass was very abundant. And when eelgrass declined, that whole fishery basically declined also and never recovered. So in the late 2008-9 period, we began an effort to collect some bay scallops from North Carolina, brought them up to Virginia, put them in quarantine, and started raising them, spawning them, and using those small scallops to plant in cages to see whether we could have a project that would lead to the restoration of bay scallops. And that effort has continued today.
I don't care if they develop a commercial fishery out of them, but I would like to see a recreational fishery, because I'd like to go get a few to eat if we can get them back out there. But it's such a weird animal. They only live 2 years, and it's going to take a bigger effort. The grass just exploded The scallops have been a little harder to get going, but we're putting a lot of effort in it, so see if we're successful. In 5 years, I mean, I would hope to see much more grass in the coastal bays with more productivity, more forage fish, more happy birds. If we get the scallops back, I'm looking forward to eating a few of them myself. I think what was important to the overall project was we sort of brought a community linked with the volunteers to be involved with something that, I mean, this is the most successful eelgrass restoration that's ever been done. I mean, 9,000 acres out there now in less than 20 years' time is phenomenal. I never would have thought 30 years ago we'd bring the grass back in my lifetime. And, you know, it's happened so fast, it's got my head spinning almost. Gives you a warm feeling to be involved with a successful, I mean, a tremendously successful restoration project.
Yes, I think. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Can you hear me? Good.
Yeah, we can
Okay,
hear you.
so great. Okay, so I got a bunch of questions, and we have lots of time. I did this so that we would have, looks like we got about 13 minutes of time to answer questions. So I'm going to start from the top of this one question. And it says here, where did you get the ecosystem service dollar numbers you cited? Okay, so this came from a published paper in the late 90s by a gentleman named Costanza. Published a paper in Nature, and they looked at all the ecosystems of the world, and they started looking at things that they do, for example, nutrient management, what animals grow in beds, and came up with a value. Now, this is a very difficult topic, trying to get economics on putting dollar values on how important it is for a person that enjoys seagrass is tough. So they look more at the nutrient issue, which is where you could come up with a decent number on what it costs to remove a certain amount of nutrients. So that's where a lot of the numbers come from. It's not comprehensive. And since that time, people are still looking at how to put the appropriate value. But what kind of value do you put on someone who goes out, fishes specifically for a fish that lives in the grass beds and just enjoys being out there catching a fish? That's a tough one. So there's social factors involved in all of this. So yeah, it's a continuing project for people to think about how best to present this to the public that understands dollars. So that was one. Let's see, let's see, I'm going to another question. After repopulating key species, scallops, as do you expect other native species to repopulate naturally, or do you have more work? What's most interesting is that outside of the bay scallops, a lot of these animals are coming back naturally. So we have been taking samples using trawls and nets, and we actually have a paper that was published in Science Advances that shows the recovery of these different types of animals, and they recovered pretty quickly. So we didn't have to do much. The fish came back, they come back every year, and we are seeing some new species coming in from the south because climate change is influencing this. But yeah, Mother Nature has basically done the rest. So what we have in that paper in Science Advances are graphics that show how quickly these plants recovered, as well as the animals. So not much to do in terms of round out the ecosystem. We've also been looking at the carbon nitrogen because, as I mentioned earlier, we were concerned about blue carbon. And again, in that paper, we show that these beds sequester large amounts of carbon, which is kind of cool. Next question, what about species diversity among seagrasses? Well, there are not a lot of species. one of the problems with seagrasses and any plant living underwater, they got to deal with salt. And salt's not an easy thing to deal with. And I think it really has been an issue trying to speciate with salt. So while we have very few species, they occur all over the world. So for example, eelgrass, the species that we work with here in the Chesapeake Bay and the coastal bays, it is the same species that occurs from North Carolina into Canada and on the west coast of Europe, all the way from Spain up into Sweden, and it occurs in the Mediterranean, west coast of the US, from the Baja up into Alaska and Japan, all over Japan. So pretty widespread. You know, these plants, they know what to do. They've done it really well for years and years. And so, yeah, didn't need a lot, but you know, not many. So that's the species diversity question. There's another one that says, please address remote sensing applications. Okay, well, we use digital imagery that we collect, and we have our people fly, or contractors fly at 13,000 feet. Seagrasses are easily visible when you have good clear water, and we always try to fly when we have clear water. And the imagery is very, very good at mapping. We use very sophisticated mapping tools that allow us to let people know how many acres of grass there are in the Chesapeake Bay. We do this every year. So that application is something we use, and people are using now this around the world. People are starting to look at satellites, because satellites today are becoming more sophisticated and much greater resolution. So years ago, satellites would be 30 meters. Now some of the satellites you can get sub-meter resolution. So people are thinking about using satellites to map seagrasses in areas where it's very difficult to put a plane, and it's working. What details are known about the causes of the sudden decline in 1933? Well, you know, back then, first of all, people didn't know much about seagrasses other than the people that harvested bay scalp or fished or hunted. You know, that was another big thing that people did back in the 30s. You know, these beds supported large numbers of waterfowl, like brant. And of course, as with the bay scalp disappeared, the brant disappeared. So, you know, people back then had to surmise what may have caused it. We know we had a big hurricane, but people started looking at the blades of grass and they were turning brown from a parasite. And they put two and two together and thought, well, maybe it was a combination of hurricanes and sudden changes in the temperature of the water that causes parasite, but it's never been conclusively proven. Of course, everyone is very interested in following what happened, because it could happen again. But the bigger issue really for seagrasses is really water quality. You know, how clear the water is. The clearer the water, the more seagrass. The dirtier the water, the less seagrass. Let's continue on with questions. We got, can we eat seagrass? Does other species eat them? Well, we don't, but believe it or not, there is a chef in Portugal that is starting to harvest seeds and using them in his recipes. There's a group of Indians in the Baja that use it for making flour, but generally there aren't many people that eat seagrass, but this chef. And there was an interesting article in Time magazine, a few months ago, that highlighted this chef and what he's doing. Of course, in that article, they cited, you know, some science parts, which is us and some other people. But in terms of other species, well, it's primarily waterfowl, brant in the winter, dugongs, manatees. Those are the big guys. Fish don't eat it. A lot of species don't eat it. It's the turtles, it's the dugongs, it's the manatees. Most of the animals that we talk about use seagrass just for habitat. So few eat it, but they're still incredibly valuable because of the structure they provide for the myriad of animals that live in the seagrass bed. How has building on the seacoast affected eelgrass? Well, when they change the shoreline from a nice sandy bottom that has seagrass to areas that are dredged and filled. That's what affects seagrass. So Florida's been a big area where we've lost a lot of seagrass because they've dredged and they've filled in areas that were important for seagrass. So the development of pressures, it's not just the building, but it's what happens with the building that delivers too many nutrients and too much sediment that causes light. So development is a problem. We are certainly becoming more aware of it, so that trying to improve developmental issues by having storm retention ponds that hold rain back, trying to plant buffer strips that will help collect sediments and nutrients before it enters. So yeah, it's a serious issue and continues to be a serious issue. What level of funding did you receive? Well, it varies by year. I can't give you the precise amount. It goes from less than $10,000 to perhaps several $100,000 a year, depending on the grants that we get. The funding has been important to the success of this program. Another question, because we're running out of time: are there any receding programs for grasses happening in Upper Chesapeake Bay? The Bay Foundation they have what's called the Grasses and Classes program, and they actually are using adult plants. There is a group at Maryland DNR that is collecting wild celery seeds and using them to plant wild celery in places like the Chester River. And that's a dominant species. The other plants that we've been seeing coming back, they're coming back naturally by spreading themselves. And I got another question. Is the recovered seagrass a variant that has been resistant? We don't know. There's a lot of genetics work that's going on, and it's hard to tell because there is just nothing known about it. So that's an area of research. We have another question called, do seagrasses have a maximum height? Oh, that's a cool question. Okay, so we say that seagrasses have what's called phenotypic plasticity. Unlike genetics, genotype plasticity, phenotypes represent what the plants look like. So eelgrass, believe it or not, can grow in really shallow water, and it might only be a few inches tall, but in deeper areas, it can grow sometimes in places maybe 10 feet. So it adapts to the places it grows, from short plants to really tall plants. It's kind of a cool thing, and that's how seagrasses have done so well, is that they can evolve and take advantage of all these different places by just changing their height. And I think we're getting close to the last 2 minutes. So if you want to learn more about it, there's lots of information on the web, but our Institute, VIMS, has a website, and a lot of the information is there about seagrasses. Or if you want additional information, you can always email me, and it was on the front page, jjorth@vims.edu. And that's at 10:49, and I think we're going to close pretty quickly. I hope you all enjoyed the talk and learned a lot about seagrasses. And when you're out in the field and looking at seagrasses, hopefully you'll have a richer appreciation for it. So enjoy the rest of the conference.